The deceptive dawn. The pre-dawn air on January 22, 1944, was cold, still, and thick with the metallic taste of the Tyrrhenian Sea. Aboard the fleet of Allied transport ships and landing ships, tank LSTs, there was a palpable sense of tense anticipation. For the nurses of the 33rd and 95th Evacuation Hospitals and the 38th and 56th Field Hospitals, this was a familiar feeling, yet different. Many were veterans of the campaigns in North Africa and Sicily, accustomed to landings met with ferocious resistance. But as the landing craft churned towards the wide, sandy beaches designated Peter and X-ray, an eerie silence prevailed. The landing was, to the astonishment of all, completely unopposed. A nurse might have noted in her diary the surreal beauty of the Italian coast and the complete absence of expected machine gun fire. The initial intelligence was correct. The Germans had been caught by surprise. The invasion force secured the beachhead with minimal casualties. The nurses, wading ashore in their olive-drab fatigues and steel helmets, felt a surge of optimism. They would set up their hospitals and be in Rome within a week. The archival logs from the 6th Corps commander, Major General John P. Lucas, reflect this confidence. His controversial decision was not to push inland immediately but to consolidate his position. This caution, born from the bloody lessons of Salerno, would prove to be a catastrophic miscalculation. It gave the German commander in Italy, Field Marshal Albert Kesselring, the precious window he needed. As the nurses began organizing their medical compounds, Kesselring was already reacting with lightning speed, directing divisions to converge on this new Allied lodgment. The soft landing was an illusion, a brief moment of calm before the storm. The gateway to Rome was about to become a cage. Hello, listener, let me know where you're watching from. And if you don't mind subscribing to the channel and giving it a like, I'd be very pleased as the author. Enjoy listening. Tents, scalpels, and sand. Within hours of landing, the beachhead was a hive of logistical activity. For the nurses and medics, this meant creating fully functional hospitals out of crates and tracts of muddy pine forest. The 33rd and 95th Evacuation Hospitals, large, semi-mobile units designed to handle thousands of patients, were established a few miles inland. Their layout, dictated by Army doctrine, was a sprawling city of canvas tents connected by rudimentary duckboard pathways. Unpacking the crates revealed the tools of their trade: folding canvas cots, sterile instrument packs, autoclaves, sulfa powder, and the precious bottles of blood plasma. Second Lieutenant Mary Roberts, a nurse with the 95th Evac, like her hundreds of colleagues, directed enlisted corpsmen with practiced efficiency. They were all products of a system designed for a war of movement, where hospitals were situated in the rear, a place of relative safety. Their training had been rigorous, but it had always been predicated on a secure perimeter. The human factor was paramount. These women, many in their early 20s from towns across America, brought a fierce sense of duty that no manual could teach. They worked to create sterile order amidst chaos, meticulously arranging their instruments as if in a state-of-the-art hospital. The analysis of medical after-action reports from this period highlights the remarkable efficiency of this setup. The chain of evacuation was a well-oiled machine, and the nurses were its critical hub. Their job was to stop death, to patch up broken bodies for evacuation or return to the fight. As they worked on January 23rd and 24th, the distant rumble of combat was sporadic. They were ahead of the curve, unaware they were setting up their immaculate wards directly in the path of what would become the most concentrated artillery bombardment of the Western Front. The sky falls. The illusion of safety shattered on January 24th. The German response, orchestrated by the masterful Kesselring, had been swift and savage. From the commanding heights of the Alban Hills and the ridges surrounding the beachhead, the newly arrived German artillery began to speak. It started as a low growl and quickly escalated into a deafening, earth-shaking crescendo. For the nurses, the sound was terrifyingly new. In North Africa and Sicily, air attacks were the primary threat to rear areas. Sustained, accurate artillery fire was for the front lines. But at Anzio, there was no rear. The beachhead was a mere 15 miles wide and 7 miles deep. Every square inch was within range. The Luftwaffe joined the assault, with Messerschmitt Bf 109s and Focke-Wulf Fw 190s strafing the beaches and hospital areas. The distinct whistle of incoming shells became the constant, nerve-shredding soundtrack of life at Anzio. Diary entries from nurses described diving for cover, the ground bucking, and the sickening sound of shrapnel ripping through their workspace. One nurse wrote, "We learned to distinguish the whistle of the 88s from the heavier boom of the 170s. We live by sound now." Their tents, marked with large red crosses as mandated by the Geneva Convention, were supposed to be protected. The Germans, however, either couldn't distinguish them or simply didn't care. The Red Cross became a target. In response, the nurses became soldiers in their own right. They learned to dig foxholes and fill sandbags to create protective berms around the operating tents. The chief nurse of the 56th Evac, First Lieutenant Rita Rourke, later reported how her staff adapted, flinching but never stopping as the ground shook. The strategic analysis is clear. By ceding the high ground, General Lucas had placed his entire force, including medical support, in a bowl. The nurses were no longer just healers, they were inhabitants of a besieged fortress. The Red Torrent. By the end of January, the German 14th Army under General Eberhard von Mackensen launched ferocious counterattacks aimed at annihilating the beachhead. The main thrust came down the Albano-Anzio road. For the nurses, the result was a sudden, overwhelming deluge of human suffering. The trickle of patients turned into a red torrent. Ambulances and jeeps lined up outside the receiving tents day and night. Triage, a brutal but necessary calculus of survival, was put to the test under unimaginable pressure. Triage officers, often experienced nurses, made split-second decisions, men with minor wounds who could wait, those requiring immediate surgery, and the expectants, those so grievously wounded that treating them would divert precious resources from others with a better chance of survival. This last category was the most soul-destroying part of their job. Archival medical records from the 95th Evac detail the horrific nature of the wounds. The German 88mm gun, used in a direct fire role, and heavy artillery created devastating trauma. Unlike clean bullet wounds, shrapnel produced massive, ragged injuries, shattered bones, and multiple internal hemorrhages. The surgical tents became scenes from Dante's Inferno. Teams of surgeons and nurses worked for 24, 36, even 48 hours without rest, fueled by caffeine and sheer adrenaline. The floors became slick with blood. The air grew thick with the smells of ether, antiseptic, and death. A nurse described the relentless rhythm: cut, tie, clamp, suture. Move the man out, bring the next one in. You didn't have time to think. You became a machine. But the human factor always broke through. They wrote letters home for soldiers who had lost hands and held the hands of the dying, offering a word of comfort that was often the only gentle thing a man had experienced in weeks. Welcome to Hell's Half-Acre. It didn't take long for the soldiers to give the pocket its name, Hell's Half-Acre. The name was bitterly accurate. The entire beachhead had become a single battleground where death could arrive at any moment. For the nurses, life settled into a grim routine defined by the ever-present threat of German artillery. Their living quarters were Spartan tents, where they slept in their clothes, ready to dive into a foxhole. The winter mud was a constant plague. Yet, the greatest psychological strain came from the shelling. The Germans employed a terrifying arsenal, but one weapon, in particular, became the symbol of Anzio's horror, the Anzio Annie. This was the Allied nickname for two German Krupp K5 283mm railway guns. Firing from hidden tunnels in the Alban Hills, these colossal cannons could hurl a 560-pound shell over 20 miles. The sound it made was unique. There was no incoming whistle. Because the shell traveled faster than the speed of sound, the first thing anyone heard was the deafening explosion, followed moments later by the sound of the gun firing. Knowing you had already been shelled before you heard it coming created a profound sense of helplessness. The nurses, like the soldiers, developed the Anzio twitch, an involuntary flinch at any loud, sudden noise. Analysis of the psychological impact reveals a state of constant, high-level stress. Yet, amid this terror, the nurses' resolve hardened. They organized their lives around the shelling. Gallows humor became a vital coping mechanism. They named their foxholes the Anzio arms and joked about which gun's shell was which. This was a conscious act of defiance, a way to reclaim a sliver of control in a world gone mad. They had arrived as medical professionals. Now they were seasoned veterans of siege warfare. The battle for Anzio had just begun, and its darkest days were yet to come. Operation Fishfang and the Human Tide. As February bled into its second week, Field Marshal Kesselring, confident he had sealed the beachhead, prepared to deliver the killing blow. On February 16, 1944, he unleashed Operation Fishfang, Fish Trap, a massive, concentrated offensive aimed at splitting the Allied beachhead in two and driving the Sixth Corps into the sea. German infantry, supported by the formidable Tiger and Panther tanks of the Hermann Göring Panzer Division, slammed into the American 45th Infantry Division along the vital Albano-Anzio Road. The fighting devolved into a desperate, close-quarters struggle for a series of gullies and a crucial overpass known grimly as the flyover. From their hospital tents, the nurses could hear the continuous, terrifying roar of this frontal battle. The result, from their perspective, was a horrifying surge in the human tide of casualties. The carefully managed system of triage and surgery that had bent under the strain now threatened to break completely. Surgical teams, who had already been working to the point of collapse, now abandoned any pretense of shifts. A declassified medical report from the 33rd Evacuation Hospital starkly notes a 400% increase in admissions during the peak of the Fishfang offensive. The nature of the wounds was changing, too. Alongside the shrapnel casualties came the devastating effects of high-velocity tank shells and close-range machine gun fire. Nurses recorded seeing entire squads brought in at once, shredded by a single artillery burst. The psychological strain was immense. They were not just treating soldiers, they were witnessing the systematic annihilation of entire units, piecing back together the men who had miraculously survived the meat grinder just a few miles away. The very air in the hospital tents seemed to vibrate with the intensity of the battle, a constant, grim reminder that the thin line of infantry holding back the German tide was all that stood between their hospital and total destruction. The cross becomes a target. The night of February 7, 1944, was relatively quiet, a rare and welcome respite. The shelling had subsided, and the exhausted nurses of the 95th Evacuation Hospital were in the middle of a shift change. Some were attempting to get a few hours of sleep in their foxholes, others were sterilizing instruments for the day ahead. At approximately 10:15 p.m., the peaceful silence was ripped apart not by artillery, but by the deeper, more sinister drone of low-flying aircraft. A flight of German bombers, slipping past the Allied air patrols, had the hospital complex squarely in their sights. The large red crosses on the tents, illuminated by hooded lights as per Geneva Convention protocols, served not as a shield, but as a perfect aiming point. A string of bombs walked directly through the hospital compound. One scored a direct hit on a surgical tent where a team was in the middle of an operation. Another landed squarely in the receiving area, and a third obliterated a ward tent filled with recovering patients. The scene, as described in the frantic after-action reports, was one of apocalyptic horror. Tents vanished in blinding flashes of light, and the screams of the wounded were drowned out by the thunder of explosions. When the smoke cleared, the devastation was absolute. Among the dead were two nurses, First Lieutenant Blanche F. Sigmund and First Lieutenant Carrie T. Sheets, along with an American Red Cross worker and numerous patients and corpsmen, including medic John Gargia. The chief nurse, Major Mildred Clark, was herself seriously wounded. An analysis of German military records after the war revealed claims that the hospital was situated too close to a munitions dump, making it a legitimate target. For the survivors on the ground, surrounded by the bodies of their friends and the tattered, blood-soaked ruins of their sanctuary, this was a grotesque lie. They had been deliberately and murderously attacked. Resilience amid the ruins. In the immediate aftermath of the bombing, chaos reigned. The surviving nurses and medics, many dazed and bleeding themselves, instinctively ran back into the inferno. The professional training ingrained in them overrode their terror. Using flashlights and lanterns, they began the grim task of digging through the wreckage, pulling the living and the dead from beneath collapsed tents and twisted metal cots. A surgical ward, moments before a place of sterile order, was now a cratered ruin, the bodies of patients and staff intermingled. Yet, within minutes, the core of their mission reasserted itself. A triage point was established in the dark, and the newly wounded, including their own colleagues, were stabilized. A nurse, whose diary entry from that night survives, wrote, "There was no time for hysterics, no time for tears. We heard a man groaning, and we went to him. That's all there was to it." The most remarkable testament to their resolve was the decision to keep the hospital functioning. With the main surgical tents destroyed, surgeons and nurses cleared a space in a remaining supply tent, laid down fresh tarps over the muddy ground, and, by the light of gasoline lanterns, continued to perform life-saving operations throughout the night. They were operating on their friends and colleagues amidst the smoking ruins of their hospital, under the ever-present threat of a return attack. This single act of collective courage, documented in the official commendations for the unit, represents the pinnacle of medical professionalism and human fortitude. They refused to let the enemy destroy not just their hospital, but their very purpose for being there. The strategic withdrawal. The deliberate bombing of the 95th evac, coupled with the relentless artillery pounding on all the other medical units, forced a critical reevaluation by the 6th Corps Command. The archival minutes from General Lucas's staff meetings reveal a stark conclusion: the forward placement of the large evacuation hospitals, a doctrine sound for a war of movement, was suicidal in a static siege. On February 12, the order was given for a phased withdrawal of the main hospitals to the relative safety of the coast. This was not a panicked retreat but a complex logistical maneuver executed under fire. The first priority was evaluating the thousands of patients already in the system. A steady stream of ambulances, braving shelled roads, transported the wounded to the beaches, where they were loaded onto LSTs, landing ship, tank. These shallow draft vessels, designed to deliver tanks to a beachhead, were now converted into makeshift hospital ships, their cavernous tank decks filled with rows of litters for the dangerous sea voyage back to Naples. Simultaneously, the nurses and corpsmen began the heartbreaking task of dismantling their shattered commands. They salvaged what equipment they could: autoclaves, surgical kits, plasma, while abandoning the heavy, tentage and cots that had been ripped to shreds by shrapnel. This strategic repositioning was a tacit admission that every inch of the beachhead was the front line and that the only true safety lay underground or on the sea. For the nurses, it was another move in a seemingly endless campaign, packing up their world of healing while the shells of Anzio and continued to rain down around them. The cellar hospitals of Nettuno. The new hospital sites were a grim improvisation. The 33rd and 95th evacuation hospitals, along with the smaller field hospitals, were relocated into the ancient coastal town of Nettuno. They abandoned their vulnerable tents for the perceived safety of stone and earth. Their new wards and operating theaters were set up in whatever space could be commandeered, primarily the large, vaulted wine cellars of a local distillery and the basements of bombed-out municipal buildings. The transition presented a new set of technological and environmental challenges. Gone was the open space of the tent city. Now they worked in cramped, claustrophobic, and perpetually damp subterranean warrens. Electricians worked frantically to run cables from portable generators to power bare light bulbs and a single, precious overhead surgical lamp. Ventilation was a constant and dangerous problem. The heavy ether used as an anesthetic could build up in the enclosed spaces, creating the risk of explosions. The nurses' notes from this period detail the difficulties of maintaining sterility in an environment of crumbling plaster and earthen floors. Yet, the tactical advantage was undeniable. The thick stone walls and ceilings, some dating back centuries, were largely impervious to all but a direct hit from the heaviest artillery. The nerve-shredding whistle of incoming shells was now a muffled thud overhead. For the first time in weeks, the nurses and their patients had a degree of physical security. They had traded the mud and shrapnel of the pine forests for the dark, dank, but solid embrace of the Nettuno cellars. It was in these underground sanctuaries that they would endure the long, brutal stalemate of the coming months. Life in the subterranean labyrinth. The move into the cellars of Nettuno marked a new phase in the nurses' ordeal. The acute, heart-stopping terror of the open field was replaced by a chronic, grinding psychological strain. Life became a troglodytic existence, governed by the dim glow of bare light bulbs and the perpetual dampness that clung to their uniforms and seeped into their bones. An analysis of personal diaries from this period reveals a profound sensory deprivation. Nurses wrote of going days without seeing the sun, their body clocks thrown into disarray by the endless cycle of 12-hour shifts in a world without day or night. The constant, muffled crump of overhead shell fire was a permanent feature of the soundscape, a dull headache that never ceased. The Anzio twitch became endemic. Yet, within this grim reality, they carved out a semblance of normalcy. In the precious hours between shifts, they would huddle together, sharing dog-eared letters from home, mending torn fatigues by lamplight, and engaging in the gallows humor that had become their primary defense mechanism. One nurse, Lieutenant Edna May Stambaugh, recalled how they learned to differentiate the sounds of the shells overhead to know which parts of town were being hit. This was not just trivia, it was crucial survival information. While providing compassionate care to their patients, they had to suppress their own fears, creating an oasis of calm professionalism in the heart of chaos. This duality, projecting strength while internally battling exhaustion and fear, was perhaps their heaviest burden. The cellars provided physical shelter, but they could not protect the mind from the slow, corrosive effects of a 4-month siege. The miracle of blood and mold. The static, confined nature of the battle forced rapid advancements in battlefield medicine, and the cellar hospitals became crucial laboratories. The most significant of these was the large-scale use of whole blood. In earlier campaigns, dried plasma was the primary tool for combating shock. It replaced fluid volume but could not carry oxygen. Anzio's horrific wounds, characterized by massive hemorrhage, demanded more. Archival logistical records detail a complex and revolutionary supply chain. Blood, typed and collected in the United States, was flown to Naples, where it was refrigerated, and then loaded onto LSTs for the perilous nightly run to the beachhead. Nurses became expert blood bankers, meticulously managing the precious, perishable supply, ensuring the right type was administered under the most challenging conditions. This logistical miracle saved thousands of lives. Simultaneously, another miracle was proving its worth: penicillin. Still a rare and almost priceless commodity, its impact on the beachhead was profound. The dirty, shrapnel-torn wounds sustained at Anzio were breeding grounds for deadly infections like gas gangrene. Army medical doctrine, based on pre-penicillin experience, often called for radical amputation to prevent its spread. But the nurses at Anzio administered the new antibiotic, witnessing firsthand its astonishing power to halt infections in their tracks, saving limbs and lives that would have been lost just a year earlier. The precise clinical notes kept by these nurses, detailing dosages and patient responses under combat conditions, became invaluable data that helped shape the widespread use of antibiotics for the remainder of the war and beyond. A touch of humanity in the dark. Beyond the technical marvels of surgery and pharmacology, the most vital function the nurses performed was profoundly human. For the thousands of young soldiers, torn from their homes and thrust into the meat grinder of Anzio, the nurses were the last remaining link to a world of normalcy and compassion. Lying grievously wounded in a damp, crowded cellar, a soldier's world had shrunk to a universe of pain and fear. The nurses navigated this landscape of despair with a gentle authority that was as healing as any medicine. Personal accounts from soldiers who survived Anzio are filled with memories of a nurse's touch, a hand that held theirs during a painful dressing change, a voice that read a letter from a mother they could no longer see, or a promise to write home on their behalf. Lieutenant Mary Roberts of the 95th Evac later spoke of the immense emotional weight of their role. They were not just clinicians, they were surrogate mothers, sisters, and confessors. They celebrated small victories, a soldier finally able to sip water, and bore silent witness to the final moments of those they could not save. This emotional labor, performed day after day amidst the carnage, was relentless. They absorbed the grief, terror, and despair of hundreds of men, offering a moment of grace that affirmed a soldier's humanity in a place designed to strip it away. It was this unwavering compassion, more than any medical procedure, that truly earned them the title angels. The duel with Anzio Annie. Even deep within the cellars, complete safety was an illusion. A direct hit from the heaviest German artillery could still penetrate their sanctuary. The primary threat remained the two Krupp K5 railway guns, Anzio Annie and her sister gun, Anzio Express. The psychological impact of these weapons cannot be overstated. Their supersonic shells arrived without warning, creating an environment of pure chance. Allied command dedicated immense resources to silencing them in a fascinating cat-and-mouse duel of technology and tactics. Declassified intelligence files show the full extent of this effort. Photo-reconnaissance Spitfires flew daily sorties, their cameras attempting to pinpoint the guns' camouflaged positions in the railway tunnels near Ciampino. Once a potential location was identified, a storm of Allied power was unleashed. Batteries of 155mm long-tom artillery would engage in counter-battery fire. Squadrons of P-40 Warhawk and A-36 Apache fighter bombers would dive-bomb the tunnel entrances. The Royal Navy's cruisers and destroyers, standing offshore, would fire their heavy naval guns into the Alban Hills. Yet, the guns possessed remarkable resilience. The German crews would roll them out of the tunnel, fire a few rounds, and immediately retreat back into the mountain's protection before the Allied response could be accurately targeted. For the nurses in their cellar wards, the duel was an audible drama, the sudden, ground-shaking crack of Annie's shell landing nearby, followed moments later by the distant roar of Allied counterfire. They were unwitting spectators in a technological battle being waged for their very survival, a battle the Allies, for all their might, would never decisively win. The Great Spring Offensive, Operation Diadem. By April 1944, the character of the beachhead began to change. The brutal winter stalemate thawed into a period of tense preparation. The Sixth Corps, now under the command of the aggressive General Lucien K. Truscott, was no longer just hanging on, it was building up for a decisive blow. A steady stream of ships brought not just supplies, but fresh divisions of infantry and entire armored battalions. The nurses saw the evidence everywhere, new stacks of ammunition crates lining the dunes, columns of Sherman tanks rumbling through Nettuno's narrow streets at night, and the faces of fresh-faced GIs who had not yet acquired the haunted, 1,000-yard stare of the Anzio veteran. The Allied High Command had formulated a grand plan, Operation Diadem, a massive, coordinated offensive designed to finally break the Gustav Line and link up with the forces on the beachhead. The Anzio breakout was a critical component of this plan. For the nurses, this build-up was a source of both hope and dread. Hope that this long, static nightmare would finally end. Dread, because they knew what a major offensive meant. They began stockpiling plasma, blood, and surgical supplies, preparing their subterranean wards for the inevitable flood of new casualties. The relative lull of the stalemate was over. A palpable tension settled over the cellars, the quiet anticipation of a storm everyone knew was about to break. They had survived the landing, the siege, and the bombing, now they steeled themselves for the final, bloody act. The breakout. At 5:45 a.m. on May 23, 1944, the 4-month stalemate at Anzio ended in a deafening, earth-shattering roar. Allied artillery, amassed in unprecedented numbers, unleashed a colossal barrage on the German positions encircling the beachhead. The sound, even from within the cellar hospitals, was overwhelming, a continuous, rolling thunder that shook the very foundations of Nettuno. For the nurses, this was the signal they had been both dreading and praying for. Operation Buffalo, the breakout phase of Diadem, had begun. Within an hour, the first casualties began to arrive. The volume and severity of the wounds were staggering, surpassing even the worst days of the February counterattacks. The carefully stockpiled medical supplies were put to immediate use. Teams of surgeons and nurses worked in a feverish, non-stop rhythm. The analysis of medical logs from the 33rd and 95th evac hospitals for the 72 hours after HR shows a patient intake rate that pushed the system to its absolute limits. Wards that were already full became impossibly crowded, with litters lining every available inch of floor space. The nature of the combat, a frontal assault against fortified German positions, produced horrific injuries from mines, machine guns, and mortars. The nurses, seasoned veterans by now, moved with a grim, practiced efficiency, their white aprons quickly stained red. They were the critical backstop to the offensive, the life-saving mechanism that allowed the Sixth Corps to sustain its ferocious momentum. Outside, the battle raged. Inside, in the dim, ether-scented light of the cellars, they waged their own relentless war against death. The road to Rome. The American and British forces punched through the German lines with brutal ferocity. By May 25th, the link-up with the advancing U.S. Fifth Army from the south was achieved, and the siege of Anzio was officially broken. For the nurses, the first tangible sign of victory was the sudden silence. After 125 days, the constant, nerve-shredding rain of German artillery finally stopped. Nurses described hesitantly emerging from their cellars, blinking in the bright sunlight, a sight many had not seen for weeks. The air, though filled with the smell of cordite, was free of the whistle of incoming shells. The strategic situation, however, presented a new logistical challenge. As the front line rapidly advanced towards Rome, the chain of evacuation had to move with it. The cellar hospitals of Nettuno were now too far to the rear. The smaller, more mobile field hospitals packed up and pushed forward, leapfrogging one another to stay close behind the advancing infantry. The larger evacuation hospitals, including the 33rd and 95th, prepared for a more deliberate move. But a controversial strategic decision by General Mark Clark, commander of the Fifth Army, altered the course of the campaign. Instead of driving inland to trap the retreating German 10th Army as planned, Clark redirected the Sixth Corps to make a direct, glory-driven push for Rome. While this decision allowed a large part of the German army to escape and fight another day, for the men and women on the ground, the goal was singular and symbolic, liberating the first European capital. The aftermath and the cost. As the main combat forces surged north, the nurses were left to deal with the staggering human cost of the campaign. The beachhead, once a claustrophobic cage, was now a vast rear area littered with the detritus of war. They treated not only the fresh casualties from the breakout but also a new type of patient, German prisoners of war. In a profound testament to their professionalism and the principles of the Geneva Convention, they provided the same level of care to the enemy soldiers as they did to their own. Accounts from nurses detail the strange, disorienting experience of treating the very men who had been shelling them for months. They also had the grim task of overseeing the recovery of thousands of liberated Allied POWs, men who were skeletal, starved, and suffering from diseases contracted in brutal German camps. The physical and psychological toll on the nurses themselves was immense. A medical survey conducted after the campaign found high rates of combat fatigue, what we now call PTSD, among the medical staff. They had endured 125 days of continuous shelling, mass casualty events, and the direct bombing of their hospitals. 6 Army nurses had been killed by enemy action during the fighting, the first American servicewomen to die in combat in the European theater. Dozens more were wounded. They were awarded Bronze Stars and Purple Hearts, official recognition that they had been true combatants in the fight for Anzio. Victory Parade in the Eternal City. On June 5, 1944, a day before the world's attention would turn to the beaches of Normandy, the women of the Anzio hospital units were given a brief, well-deserved respite. They were loaded onto trucks and driven up the historic Appian Way into the heart of a liberated Rome. For women who had spent 4 months living in muddy foxholes and subterranean cellars, the sight of the magnificent city, the Colosseum, the Roman Forum, was overwhelming. The streets were thronged with jubilant Italians, cheering, throwing flowers, and offering wine. One nurse recalled the surreal feeling of being celebrated as a liberator, her olive-drab fatigues a stark contrast to the ancient stone and joyous crowds. A small contingent of nurses was chosen to march in the official victory parade, representing the thousands of medical personnel who had made the liberation possible. It was a fleeting moment of triumph, a public acknowledgement of their sacrifice. A surviving archival newsreel captures the scene, exhausted but smiling, these American women marching past ancient monuments, a living symbol of resilience. This day in Rome was more than a tourist trip, it was a psychological turning point, a definitive end to the horror of the beachhead and a validation of their endurance. Legacy of the Angels. The story of the Anzio nurses did not end in Rome. They would continue to serve, moving with the armies through the campaigns in France and into Germany itself. But Anzio remained their crucible. Their performance under fire fundamentally altered the U.S. Army's perception of the role of women in a combat zone. The analysis of their service led to doctrinal changes in the placement and defense of medical units. Their experience demonstrated that nurses were not just support staff but integral, resilient members of the fighting force, capable of withstanding the worst physical and psychological pressures of modern warfare. The commendation for the 95th Evacuation Hospital's Presidential Unit citation reads as a summary of their legacy, praising their extraordinary heroism and collective gallantry in action. Yet, their greatest legacy lives on in the thousands of men who survived because of them. They were ordinary women, teachers, secretaries, farm girls from across America, who, when placed in an extraordinary and terrifying situation, proved to possess an inner strength as formidable as any armor. On Hell's Half-Acre, amidst the steel, blood, and mud, they demonstrated a form of courage defined not by aggression, but by an unwavering commitment to healing and grace under the most extreme fire. The angels of Anzio proved that in the calculus of war, the power to save a life is as vital and heroic as the power to take one.